And secondly, I have to state one thing before I get into what I have into my main remarks, and that is that when you have so little time and so much information, you're forced to condense and focus on important issues. And in doing my presentation, this is going to sound very critical, and it is very critical, of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. involvement in the Balkans. But having said that, I have to say, and I'm not just saying this because he's sitting right next to me and within striking distance, there are diplomats who I value, who I respect, and Jonathan is one of them. So what I have to say are general remarks about policy and about implementation. They're not geared towards anybody specific. And please tell Phil that as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Having said that, let me start with a quotation. And this is from a book, in the preface to the book, by Matthew Parrish, somebody who served in Bosnia as a lawyer and an advisor to the High Representative in Bosnia, in particular the Deputy High Representative, who was an American diplomat on loan to the international mission, and also the supervisor of the town of Brčko, which is another complication in Bosnia if it wasn't complicated enough. But I won't get into those complications. I'm just going to focus on some broad issues. And in the preface he says, he talks about an internal crisis that everybody deals with when they get involved in these type of international interventions and state building enterprises. And that is, he says, the main message I have sought to convey in these pages is one of deep moral uncertainty about the wisdom and efficacy of what the international community has recently been doing in this country. Towards the end of the period that I was in Bosnia, as the organization I worked for collapsed, almost every day I asked myself whether my job could be viewed as a valuable contribution to post-conflict reconstruction or only an absurd neo-colonial indulgence with no prospect of long-term sustainability. And I think this is really at the heart of my message here and what I have to say. This struggle that we deal with from the West in looking at countries who are ripped by conflict, wanting to help, and then we get to a position of post-conflict settlement, whatever that settlement may be, and then acting on it. And how we deal with the fact that we think we're doing great big things, but in the day-to-day administration of trying to help, sometimes we end up with results that were never intended. And having said that, let me talk about a few things. Now this dilemma is at the heart, and I apologize, I'm going to read some of this because I have two presentations tomorrow. And if I allow my thoughts to wander, I'm going to be talking about the Pristina-Belgrade agreement that was made and not focus on this issue because that's been dominant in my brain for the last couple of days. And I'm sure that's with you as well.
Yes, I'll be testifying tomorrow too.
Yeah. So having said that, this dilemma is really at the heart of every reconstruction or state building undertaking, from Haiti to Bosnia, from the Balkans to North Africa. It is also at the heart of any serious discussion concerning possible lessons learned from the international state building efforts in Bosnia and Kosovo. And yes, I say state building, I don't say nation building, because I think that's an important distinction to be made. It's hard to talk about nation building in countries that have a crisis of identity, like in Bosnia, and especially when you have people who are yet to come to terms with their own identity. Who are they? Many of them were Yugoslavs. That state no longer exists. For Bosniaks, now we use the term Bosniak, but we used to use the term Muslim. And there's still a debate in Bosnia as to what proper term to use and how to identify oneself in the upcoming census, if it will ever be held in 2020. So having said that, I think it's important to understand that what we're trying to do is build states, institutions, infrastructure, capacity, leadership, democratic culture, rule of law. That is what really we're trying to build. And when we talk about building democracy, I want to use the definitions that your first panel put out. I think that's the most useful type of approach to dealing with the idea of building democracy. So let's get into it. Both Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo, the international community had engaged early in Bosnia through UN military observers and humanitarian relief. and in Kosovo through OSCE military observers and humanitarian relief. In both cases, NATO-led military interventions were launched and influenced the post-conflict settlements that were initiated. In Bosnia, the bombing of Bosnian Serb positions and equipment were conducted under the authority of the United Nations, while in Kosovo, the bombing of Serbia's military, civilian infrastructure, and communications were conducted by NATO without the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. Both conflicts were ended without decisive defeats of any of the warring sides, and peace agreements that followed did not fully address the underlying issues that fueled the conflicts in the first place. The Dayton Accords was a very specific peace agreement that produced the current constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but that in effect created tremendous ambiguity as to how the state it created would function. Its original intent was to create a highly decentralized state, but as it was implemented through the High Representative, much of the powers and the authority of the two entities and the 10, I would argue even the 10 cantons of the Federation, and those two entities are the Republic of Srpska and the Bosniak-Croat Federation, or just the Federation, were forcefully diminished, and many competencies were transferred to the joint state institutions. The Kosovo conflict ended with the Kumanovo Agreement, but this was not an agreement between, this was an agreement between NATO and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and not between the Albanian paramilitary, the Kosovo Liberation Army, and Serbia. And this is an important difference to keep in mind when we talk about the comparison between the Kosovo case and the Bosnian case. In Bosnia, this conflict was resolved by the parties. The outside parties, Serbia and Croatia, who were involved in Bosnia, as well as the local parties to the conflict, and the international community. The Dayton Accords produced the central document for peace building. The Kumanovo Agreement really didn't produce any central guideline, so to speak. It set the technical issue of how to enforce the peace between NATO and Serbia and what the terms of the peace are. And then there was a Security Council Resolution 1244, which provided a legal background for what was going to be the state building. But that only lasted very briefly. Much can also be said about the military lessons learned from the Balkans and how these interventions influenced other interventions in Libya, Iraq, or it was first Iraq, then Libya, and now in Syria. But that's a subject for some other time and some other panel and some other discussion. It is enough for now to know that without clear victors on the ground, and there were no clear victors, militarily speaking, on the ground, the peace process and state building that followed were bound to face great difficulties. As retired Australian Air Marshal Ray Funnell observed following the Kosovo War, and I quote him, "However, to consider the Kosovo conflict in terms of winning and losing is surreal. Little, if anything, has been won. Thousands have been killed, a major part of Yugoslavia's infrastructure has been destroyed, ethnic enmities have been reinforced, and the world, through the United Nations and NATO, has taken on a peacekeeping task that will be very demanding of political, military, and financial resources for a long time." And I think he was right. I mean, we're seeing that even now with this negotiating process in terms of trying to fix what wasn't addressed at Kumanovo and in the Security Council Resolution 1244. Now, this paper broadly deals with the post-conflict involvement of the international community. In both post-conflict protectorates, I argue there were protectorates, quasi-protectorates that were created in Kosovo and in Bosnia. In both Kosovo and Bosnia, the international community, led by the United States and the EU, created quasi-protectorates, which over several years were governed indirectly through a representative of the principal actors. In Bosnia, this was the High Representative, and in Kosovo, the UN Special Representative. In both cases, these two officials were to serve mostly in the capacity of supervising the implementation of the peace agreement and of post-conflict development and reconstruction. They were also to serve as facilitators, mediators, and arbitrators when it came to potential disputes in the post-conflict implementation of the peace agreement. However, in both cases, these two international representatives and their offices assumed executive and legislative powers, usurping the authority of government institutions, the parliaments, elected officials, and even courts. In effect, they became imperial, or here's the word that people shyly mentioned in the previous panels, colonial-like